What's going on, guys? Meteorologist Jonathan Kagas, joined by meteorologist David Nazario. What's going on, my friend?
Not much. All I have to say is we are definitely back. We're doing it all over again. This is a very familiar sight from last hurricane season from one into another.
Exactly. We're going to talk about hotspots today. Now, I want to issue the disclaimer here that just because an area highlighted, and we're obviously focusing on Florida here, but just because an area that's highlighted might have a low probability of a landfall, it does not mean that it is a zero chance. Same deal in the same conversation that just because there's a high probability of a strike does not mean that it is a guarantee that it is going to happen. We are looking at trends, we are looking at analogs, we are looking at some long range climate forecasts to come up with our probabilities. Using all of that, did okay last year. We talked about a high chance that Texas would get hit. They had Beryl. We talked about a high chance last year in 2024 that the Gulf Coast of Florida would be hit. There were 3 impacts over there. And then we also talked about the Northeast Caribbean, including Puerto Rico. There was Ernesto, and there were a lot of other close calls before some curves. So last year's forecast, unfortunately, worked out. Without further ado, we are going to get right into it because we know that is what you are expecting. So first and foremost, this is the 2025 hurricane season. What we are predicting anyway, at least what we're watching for the potential hotspots. We're zoomed in on Florida first. What sticks out here is, again, the red being the Gulf Coast. And then we also have a big swath of orange on the Atlantic coast, David.
Yes, that's correct. And I'm in full agreement of this. Jonathan and I spent an extended period of time, truthfully, what you could say the last couple of months, more or
Mhm.
less brainstorming these hotspots for not only this video, but just as we rock through the hurricane season. The general thinking does seem to favor, these pieces of Florida. We'll start with Florida, then we'll go ahead and zoom on out. But it definitely seems like, once again, West Coast Florida, Gulf Coast Florida is probably going to be in a position to take another potential landfall,
Yeah.
or dare I say, 2. We're not predicting the landfalls, but we're saying we're poised that if things get going in the right source regions, then it's needless to say it could come headed our way.
And we're going to get into some of the reasons why. We wanted to show you the kind of the answer before the work here because when everybody's interested in, okay, where might the hot spots be? So again, that Gulf Coast, and we'll kind of zoom out to show you the whole thing because this is going to go into play how we came to this answer. We think there's a low chance, again, not a zero chance, on the Gulf Coast of Texas down to the Bay of Campeche and then also into the western side of the Yucatan. There is a very high chance, we think, again, closer to the Bahamas. So while there's a moderate shot for a landfall on the Atlantic side of Florida, we do believe there's a high opportunity for impact in the Bahamas and Turks and Caicos. You'll see this in, again, the reason for this forecast, but we do think a pretty hot track, and let me hit the play button here so that I can actually telestrate. We do think that a very hot track is going to be something like this. Now, we're hopeful for Florida standards that, again, pending the Bermuda High, that it does stay like that. But then as we zoom out again, we do think that there's going to be a high probability that maybe that heads towards the outer banks of the Carolinas, North Carolina, and then potentially close to the East Coast. But again, one of the hot tracks that we see is something like this, and then something like potentially that as well. Those are at least the 2 things from the analog years that we've looked at that kind of stick out to me, and I know you as well.
Yes, absolutely. It does seem like we are being in a neutral ENSO phase as well. I'm not anticipating, neither one of us are anticipating a very powerful subtropical ridge out there across the Atlantic, the Bermuda Azores High, which actually, in essence, saved us from 2, if not 3 additional landfalls last hurricane season. If you all recall,
Yeah.
we had that corridor for both Raphael and what was becoming Sarah to lift back up towards the north and east. So we could have sustained 2 more hurricane landfalls. Sarah projected to be a major hurricane before it crashed into Central America because the western extent of that Bermuda high pressure built back in. We don't quite think that's going to be the case this year, and I'll have some overlays later on into the briefing as well to show you why we think that is, and we could see a lot of recurvatures near the Bermuda area and perhaps kind of creating a corridor almost between Bermuda and the east coast of the United States, Jonathan.
So to kind of take that and push it forward here, this is the start of the, okay, why do we think the Gulf Coast of Florida is a hot zone and why we think that there's at least going to be one or more tropical threats on the Atlantic side of Florida, which hasn't happened in a very, very long time. Of course, Dorian was a threat, Isaias was a threat, never made landfall. Matthew was a threat, thankfully never made landfall. Although those coastal ones, the near misses, do impact our coast a lot. So we're gonna be watching those. But ENSO neutral, as David was getting at, so not a La Nina, not an El Nino. We're right in the middle of that. That has its own kind of trajectories that we'll get into. Another big player in this is a very active African monsoon season. When there is an active African monsoon season, we do see more of those tropical waves rolling off the African continent more, which, given the correct environment, once they enter there, could lead to tropical systems developing. And then we do have cooler temperatures than 2024. Not cooler than normal, cooler than 2024. But after doing extensive research and kind of analysis of last year, one of the things that, I mean, thankfully, and I say thankfully loosely because it was a super high impact year, it could have been worse, like the preseason forecasts alluded to, had it not been for uniformly warm waters across the Atlantic. And David has a lot of that coming up in just 1 second as we go forward in this. Neutral, it kind of leads to, okay, we don't have something guiding the season like you would a La Nina. So we're not talking about wind shear in the Caribbean to kind of rip the storms apart like you would have in a La Nina. And we don't have the crazy anomalous rising motion to help favor the storms either in the Atlantic. But it does leave room for other weather systems, like David mentioned about the Azores High, Bermuda High, things like that, to be in place or not be in place. And one of the things, this came up early in our conversation months ago, was this study that Florida State University did way back when. Way back when. Now, I want to caution that these lines here are just taking the Florida landfall. So it does look like, okay, Florida is the hot zone here. But just showing this, that in an ENSO neutral year, there are a lot of storms that kind of take aim toward Florida, whether it be, okay, look at that Western Caribbean zone or some of those more long track storms. And while we may not be favoring some of the more long track storms this year, we might have to watch for some of those waves kind of getting towards the Northern Caribbean and then getting towards the Turks and Caicos. And then, okay, the water is going to be juiced out there and then kind of firing up quick. And that's, I think, going to maybe the other MO, that we're going to have these short-lived storms that maybe a couple days out are looking like nothing, and then all of a sudden, because of the warmth of the water and the proximity to home, David, we're going to have to be on guard for those kind of very quick spin-ups like we've had over the last couple of years.
Big time. That's actually something that National Hurricane Center and especially NOAA are emphasizing this hurricane season. They've been using the adage that every major hurricane, whether it be Cat 3, 4, or even Category 5, that has made landfall somewhere in a highly populated area of the United States was only a tropical storm or less than that 3 days prior to landfall. And rapid intensification is a real thing. That's something that we're going to be very closely watching, not only here in the News 6 Weather Center, but across the board. National Hurricane Center wants to try to beef up their attempts at pinpointing and nailing down these rapid intensification cycles. And kind of to echo what Jonathan had mentioned, because of the cooler waters, relatively cooler. You know, it's not like they're cold and they're incapable of producing tropical cyclones, but because of the cooler waters and where it is we see our warmest anomalies loaded up this hurricane season, we could possibly have broad areas of low pressure or tropical waves meandering through the main development region or somewhere in the Atlantic basin. And then as they get closer, unfortunately, to our populated regions, whether it be our friends in the Caribbean, Bahamas off the east coast of Florida, or somewhere near Central America, that is where our warmer water temperatures are very heavily focused. So we could possibly be seeing an indication of that as we get into the first half of June. Even we've got a couple things pinpointing the potential for our first named storm attempt. So we'll see exactly how that behaves. But Jonathan, go ahead and take it away if you want to elaborate on that further even.
Yeah, no, for sure. No, I echo all of that. If you want to bring your computer full screen, and we'll get over to some of those temperature anomaly graphics to kind of go forward with telling this story here. This is how we really came to what we just showed you to lead off with the hot zone map, David.
Yeah, so what we have here is going to be just, the general SST configuration on the global perspective. And two things immediately jump out. And I'll go ahead and highlight the third. I'm going to leave that to ambiguity for now. But the two things that really stand out, despite the ENSO neutral conditions out there, is the fact that most of the central tropical Pacific and the eastern tropical Pacific, from about the southern coast of California through the Baja California Peninsula and then down into our ENSO regions, we're still fairly cool. Most of our substantial, noticeable warmth is still loaded up on the west side, and I credit this information more so to Dr. Levi Cowan of Tropical Tidbits. He also pointed this out in a wonderful video he put out not too long ago, but the science makes sense. If you look at the Indian Ocean as well, we have those cooler anomalies on the western side, which is also going to help to favor a little bit of that oomph, that extra lift, and pick me up that the Atlantic Basin would need to get storms going, at least spinning up those tropical waves. And as Jonathan had mentioned, all of our climate models, the dynamical models, are pointing towards a fairly enhanced West African monsoon, the WAM, as I like to say. It looks fairly whammy out there through Africa, which is also likely going to contribute to warming the Atlantic just a little bit more. I'll take in for a closer look now, and just as like we were talking about moments ago, if you look at where our hottest, I won't even say the term warm, where our hottest anomalies are right there off the coast of the southeast and mid-Atlantic United States, right off our west coast in the Gulf, hugging the coastline of the Panhandle, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and then down through the Caribbean. We've seen a little bit of cooling thanks to our easterly trade winds, but regardless, most of our greatest ocean heat content as well is loaded up west of 60 degrees longitude, which is something that Colorado State University does project in their predictions as well. They are forecasting most of our ACE is likely to come west of that 60-degree longitude line, which is very interesting. We've also seen some pretty decent warming where it kind of matters in the MDR between 5 and 10 degrees latitude, and it is slowly but surely beginning to lift further than that. You come over to the CANSIPS. We're going to get an update from this climate model here very soon, within the next couple days. By Sunday, we'll have a fresh batch of seasonal data to look at. And if you take a look closely at what the anomalies are projected to do as we wander through the hurricane season, we are expecting additional warmth, that's for sure. We are still going to be in the phase where the northern hemispheric Atlantic is still in a more favorable setup for warmth, anomalous warmth. And you can see the cooler anomalies off the southwest coast of Africa down there in the southern hemisphere, which would be, I believe that is still the positive AMM is the acronym for it. We are still flipped into that favorable switch phase, if you will, for Atlantic tropical cyclone activity. Pending the other intraseasonal variables we watch because of that ENSO neutral. It's kind of like a level playing field out there. I do have our latest kind of, you could say, mid-season climate forecast system, CFS, pulled up, and I just want you to notice what happens here. In June, we're already predicting, or I should say the model is suggesting, a fairly robust rainfall pattern, not only through the MDR, despite those, quote, cooler anomalies, but especially closer to home in the Caribbean and in the Eastern Gulf, which is part of the reason why we have our hotspots layered the way that we do. If you go into July, surprisingly, we're still holding that signal, and then it goes without saying, by August, we are off to the races thanks to that neutral pattern in the ENSO regions of the tropical Pacific. We more likely are looking at a mixed bag type of setup to where we will have some features, find an escape route, and recurve out into the central Atlantic, causing no harm or foul. But then you can also notice closer to home, we have some of our greater rainfall anomalies hugging the greater Antilles to the north of the islands, through the Turks and Caicos, the Bahamas, and potentially up our eastern seaboard, with a few of those entities, or at least our rainfall anomalies, really showing up throughout the Gulf off our west coast. And then finally, to tie it up into a nice bundle, I have our Euro seasonal model indicating that we aren't exactly going to have an enormously positive North Atlantic oscillation, which is essentially the difference between a low pressure off the coast of Iceland and Greenland and then our Bermuda Azores high. If you notice, we are nudging it further towards the west here in the months of July, August, and September. But note where the center of circulation of our anticyclone, that high pressure, is positioned, right over the Azores. So it would suggest we are going to have fairly dominant high pressure out there. It's not going to be a 2023 where the subtropical jet and all that hot water is helping to keep that sandwiched up against the coasts of Europe and Africa. I do think it is going to be fairly spread out in a west to east configuration across the Atlantic for a good majority of the hurricane season, at least until we get into the likes of September and October. And you can see even here the model is predicting a bit of a breakdown as we begin to get closer to the fall and start to approach that transitional season time frame. Here's a look at our latest ENSO forecast. We've finally started to break free of that spring predictability barrier. And what's been surprising to us is the fact that during the months of January, February, March, and even the first half of April, because of that predictability barrier, where it's just a little more difficult for any type of model or forecaster to get a hand on what exactly is going to happen with our ocean temperatures and the way that they're set up through the equatorial Pacific, we've actually trended out of the warmer anomalies. And if you look here, it isn't until early next year now where any of our climate models actually do pinpoint us climbing into a warm neutral phase. For the duration of the hurricane season and the rest of 2025, they're beginning to favor a slow creep back into a cool neutral phase, if not even a brief return to La Nina conditions, which is incredibly reminiscent of last hurricane season. You can see the same thing here. I'll go ahead and zoom it in a little bit so you all can see a little bit better there at home. If you notice, our El Nino probabilities are flat. We're looking at maybe 10-15% of a likelihood that we will be in El Nino for the peak of the hurricane season, let alone the rest of the calendar 2025 year. We are now neck and neck with the La Nina and ENSO neutral probabilities. And the best way to interpret this is our greatest shot of an ENSO phase is likely to be neutral, but it could go either way during the months of September, October, November, and October, November, December. That's why they're so close together, the blue line here and the gray line there. And then last but not least, just to kind of tease ahead a little bit in terms of what I'd mentioned previously about the first half of June being somewhat favorable for our first named storm attempt, it does look like the Madden-Julian oscillation is coming into some of its more favorable phasing between the dates of about June 5th to possibly even the back end of June to its entirety. There will be a little bit of sinking as we transition between phases of the MJO. If you'd like a little more information on that, I put together an article over on clickorlando.com kind of breaking down the science of that. If you're unfamiliar with the MJO, that acronym that will be tossed around quite a bit during the hurricane season, but where you see those shades of bluish, teal, greenish colors, that would indicate we are going to see rising motions and an increase in all the ingredients we would need to technically produce a tropical cyclone as we rock through the month of June here very soon. So with that being said, I'll go ahead and take myself full screen, let Jonathan take the wheel. That's pretty much all I've got, folks, and why it is we're probably going to be seeing the tropical cyclone activity like we have projected in our hotspot map.
Yeah, and again, just the disclaimer, just because you're in the red does not mean that's where we're going to have a landfall. It just means that there are indications and some of the clues that the atmosphere is giving us that it's a little bit higher than everywhere else that has an opportunity. Plus, we've been in this last 5 years. That has been just a regional hotspot as well. And again, we're going to be watching the Atlantic closely as well. Regardless if you were in the yellow, orange, or red, the low, medium, or high. And of course, we do think Florida is a hotspot where it typically always is because it does stick out on water on three sides. It's always important to be prepared. And of course, at News 6, we're going to keep it covered, whether we're under the gun or not, to make sure that you're getting the best weather information. Of course, we say it every year. There's a lot of hype. There's a lot of misinformation. You're not going to get that from us. You're going to get the sound science and the meteorology and how it could possibly impact you to the best of our ability. So with that said, I hope you found this informative, educational, and News 6, that's going to be your trusted source. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this. We'll catch you soon.